back in chapter 1, and we mentioned this last week, we began this investigation into Torah, this investigation into the validity of the Tanakh, based on Micah 6:2. Ancient Israel had claimed that the way of Yahweh, the law given at Mount Sinai and again in Deuteronomy, that it was unfair, that it was impossible to keep, that it was not a way of life that worked, but it was something that was biased and only favored a select few in Israel's congregation. And in fact, this was the allegation that Israel made in Micah 6:2. It says, "Hear, O you mountains, Yahweh's controversy, you strong foundations of the earth. For Yahweh has a strong controversy. He will plead with Israel. O my people, what have I done to you, and where have I wearied you? Testify against me." So we have brought this case as far as are Israel's allegations, are they substantiated? Do they stand up? Did ancient Israel and modernly today, does humanity have the ability to observe the law? Did ancient Israel have that ability? Ezekiel also reiterates this point when in Ezekiel 18, and it's reiterated again in Ezekiel 33, where he says, "Yet you say the way of Yahweh is not equal. Hear now, O house of Israel, is not my way equal, and are not your ways unequal?" So again, it is this controversy that we are looking at, and we've looked at a lot of parts of the law, and I am going to go ahead and do a recap. I know we kind of did one last week, but again, I don't want to miss anything because it kind of builds on itself as we go forward. And just a word of warning, we may go over a little bit again tonight. We had a late start and there's a lot of material to cover. So don't be surprised if we're here till about 10 o'clock tonight, maybe even a little bit beyond that. It's just a lot of material to cover. So I see Cindy says that you lost me. Let me type this. Okay. All right. So we find that, and I'm going to just summarize the two modern concepts under which ancient Israel's allegation usually fall. Number one, it is what I call the Mount Everest allegation. This is the idea that Yahweh gave ancient Israel a law that is good, it does work, but he knew that ancient Israel would never be able to observe it. It is as though giving a mentally delayed child a course in history or a course in mathematics well beyond his years or his ability, but yet punishing them when he fails, or ancient Israel failed, to observe it, to meet the stipulation, to meet the requirements. This is what I term the Mount Everest theology. The second theology that we have is the stacked deck theology. This is the idea that Israel could keep the law to some varying extent, but God had never really given her the ability to overcome her sins. He had never given her a dispensation of his spirit to enable her to observe the law fully and completely. So we're going to look at, maybe challenge some of those ideas, which I argue are a carryover and a remainder of ancient Israel's allegations, a controversy that has never been decisively decided one way or the other. And I hope that we can decide that controversy and put that controversy more or less to rest tonight by looking at the spiritual nature of the law and what that meant to ancient Israel and its implications for us today. So again, the constitutional covenant, and I do say it is constitutional because that is indeed what Torah defines. It defines a constitution of law for humanity to follow, for ancient Israel to follow, that is based on the concepts of liberty. And let's again reiterate some of these laws just real quick, and some of these precepts. You had non-taxable land. Hopefully it wasn't toxic either. Non-taxable land. You had constitutionally defined taxation at 10%. You had limited government, and the government was limited because the land the government could own was limited. Remember, the Levites were very limited. They had no tribal possessions. And because the Levites formed the society's government, it was very limited in the responsibilities it could assume. You also had a representative government, in that you had some elected officials, you had representatives in the Adah, you had a voting assembly based on land ownership. You also had constitutionally defined human rights. This is something that you find in no other ancient law code. No other ancient law code upholds a woman's rights in marriage as far as economic rights. Really, the Torah is the first to advance those ideas. The Torah is the first to advance the ideas that foreigners and immigrants are entitled to the same rights under the law as native citizens. This, again, is really the first in the ancient world. The other first in the ancient world that we find is the fact that slaves have some limited rights under the law as well. The other thing that we find in Israel's law code is that it banned usury. And usury differs from straight interest, say, like on a business loan. They really work quite differently, because in usury, you could lose your possessions, your home, and the loan could be called at any time. The interest, like business interest that is charged today, was allowed for a period of 6 years, and then it was forgiven every 7 years. Could not be called at any time. You really had that entire 7 years, or in other situations, perhaps a period of 49 years in which to meet that debt. You had constitutionally defined days off, days of rest that were given to you as public holidays. These, again, are defined at a constitutional level so that Israel could have the peace, the prosperity, and the freedom to enjoy their families, to enjoy their life. It also mentions slaves in particular, that bondservants are given those days off. It's not just for Israel's citizens, it is for all the entire nation. You also find that God readily recognized that Israel could not observe the Torah. They could not obey or follow the Torah within the land of Egypt or within another society. So rather than trying to establish a parallel society within Egypt, Yahweh calls Israel out of Egypt, and he establishes Israel on her own land, on her own inheritance, so that she can abide by Torah and establish Torah's constitution. You find as well that, this idea of taking Israel out of the nations, and that Israel would be different from the nations, which one area in which they differed from all the nations of the earth was in its approach to healthcare. We think of nationalized healthcare being a very modern view and a very modern approach to social services and to human and government relations. It actually is not. These ideas and these controversies, these politics have really been around for well over 3,000 years. In ancient Mesopotamia, they dealt with it. As a matter of fact, the government would subsidize what they deemed to be pharmaceuticals, drugs back in those days, although their effectiveness was not near what we have today. You had ancient Egypt that provided health care for your mortuary workers and your engineers. And then you had the grand poobah of healthcare in the ancient Near East, which was Greece, where the temple locus served as a hospital for all of those that came there. And so when Israel says that they want to be like the nations of the earth, they want to have a king, they want to have these more rigid forms of government, and Yahweh says that it is departing from his life-giving way, these are the things that Yahweh is talking about. These are the ideas that he is addressing. As we go into the Sinai and Moab covenant, we find that there is perfect harmony between the Sinai and the Moab. We find that there is an added provision in Deuteronomy where at first your slave could go out free, and now that we come to Deuteronomy, and after all of Israel's rebellion and Yahweh seeing the oppression within Israel's own heart and Israel's desire to oppress her fellow citizens, that now God adds stipulations to preserve and protect the poor and the indigent. But even within this preservation and these added requirements, God does not penalize the wealthy. He rather just protects the poor. He fosters national solidarity. And again, it maintains a different nation, even at this point, from all the nations of the earth. We also find within the book, within the Tanakh, that people could be righteous in Yahweh's sight. Whether we look at Noah or Abraham or David. David sinned. David committed murder. He also committed adultery. But he repented and he returned to the way of Yahweh. And except for that instance, David's life is used as a standard for all the other kings of Judah. They are all compared to David, and they are said, this person did what was right as like David his father. So David maintains that standard of righteousness. It did not mean that they were without sin, but it means that when they did sin, they would repent and return to the way of Yahweh, the derek of Yah. They would return to it and they would live by it. We also looked last time at Job. We looked at the contrast between Job and his three Edomite friends. We have Eliphaz, Zohar, and Bildad, who we find that Yahweh states these three men did not speak that what was right of Yahweh. So when you look through their testimony, you find that one of the theologies they embraced, one of the doctrines they maintained in their Edomite ideology, was the idea that humanity cannot be clean in Yahweh's sight. In fact, this is what they were accusing Job of, was that he could never be righteous in God's sight. But Job maintained his righteousness. He rebutted their arguments, and he says, I will hold on to my righteousness. I will not let go of it. And he says, I will be justified with God. And at the end, Yahweh upheld Job's position and he condemned the three friends. So as we progress into the idea of Israel's covenant, we looked at a lot of the government aspects of it, of how it established a righteous government. And this theocracy wasn't something that was nebulous, something that was undefined. It was something that was real world. It was a constitution very similar to America's modern constitution. It just simply addressed more moral issues than what the American Constitution does. But yet the question still remains, can we be clean in God's sight of our own accord? Do the sins from Edom, even today, still separate us from a relationship with God? So much of the law, I remember growing up and being told by pastors that Israel's Torah, the Pentateuch, was nothing but do's and don'ts, that it was really just this physical law that never spoke to humanity's heart. So tonight what I want to do is look at more of this relationship of the heart that God establishes within his Torah. I mentioned last week how the Torah establishes a relationship between man and his fellow man, between man and his God, and then between man and his state, his representative body, and then between the state, man, and God. So we have a lot of interaction and a lot of interplay between these different functions within Israel. The law tells us, and you find that the prophets say this as well, that the law establishes a state of being that makes life perpetual. It makes life ongoing. It's this state of life that simply exists, and as long as that state is achieved within society, life continues on and there is no death. Let's look at a couple of these texts. I am going to be on page 289. I am going to be jumping around quite a bit. And again, I am going to read quite a bit again tonight as well, simply because I cannot express it any better than what I think it is written. To me, the way it is written it just speaks for itself, in my opinion. So we're going to look at this idea that the law is able to sustain life. And if you follow it, it becomes a bread of life that really, a way that there is no death. So look at page 289. This is Solomon in Proverbs 12:28. He says, in the way of righteousness there is life, and in the pathway, the Hebrew there is direct, there is no death. So if we're walking in righteousness, there is no death. So that is, again, the idea of life sustaining. Ezekiel 33 verse 15 states that the Torah contains statutes of life. On page 295, if you guys are following along, you really don't have to turn page to page here. I'm jumping around quite a bit. But we find in Deuteronomy 30, verse 17, the idea that following Torah prolongs your days on the land. So it's this idea of increased life. And if you'll remember Isaiah, when he talks about this restoration on the land, he speaks of our days being as the days and the length of a tree, and that a person who dies at 100 is a premature death. So these are ideas that to us today seem very out of place, but it was not out of place where the Torah is concerned. Because the Torah just gives life. You also find that so much of the Torah is not do's and don'ts, as I mentioned before, but it is spiritual matters, matters that have to do with the heart, the mind, the intention. To love your brother in Leviticus 17 is to rebuke your brother when he sins. It's not just to have platitudes and to have kind thoughts or a just a good disposition. It always has to be backed up by something physical. There's this old saying that talk is cheap. Torah definitely maintains that idea, because it doesn't tell you to just love your brother. Yahweh always gives you some very practical application and very practical means by which you can follow through and demonstrate that love, or whatever it is, the circumcision of your heart, which is a spiritual command. The first step to that spiritual circumcision is going to be male physical circumcision. So you can't have one without the other. If you want to jump to the spiritual without the physical, you're really jumping ship and you're going to miss the boat, because the physical contains such important life lessons that you really cannot learn any other way. So we find that in the idea of loving your neighbor as yourself, God does not tell you to love your neighbor more or yourself less. Rather, it is an equality. So you're not above your neighbor and your neighbor is not above you. So that's another concept. We also find this idea of service of the heart, that to really follow Yahweh, to follow his Torah, we are going to follow it wholeheartedly, a very holistic interpretation where our thoughts, our minds, and our desires is something we are going to discipline ourselves, to train ourselves and to bring ourselves in line with that. I think people who grow up in a Torah observant home are going to be already on this path. Their parents are going to do a lot of that training for them. A lot of that correction is going to be administered by parents, so that when you get to adulthood, you're going to have a leg up. You're going to already be there, and it's going to be easier for you. You find in 1 Samuel 12:24 that, let me get to this text here, that in serving Yahweh, truth is very important. And let's look at this verse. This is 1 Samuel 12:24 and 25. This is when Israel comes before Samuel and asks for a king. Samuel says, only fear Yahweh and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider how great things he has done for you. So this idea is that we should serve Yahweh in truth, and that we live not by physical things alone, but by every word that proceeds out of Yahweh's lips. Now remember this idea of humanity living by every word that proceeds out of Yahweh's mouth, that's reiterated in Deuteronomy 8:3. At this point in time, this was spoken right before Israel enters the promised land. At this point in time, the only thing that had been spoken to Israel were the covenants, and they were God's statutes, laws, commands, and judgments. So these are the things that contain truth. These are the things that contain life. Psalms 119, 142, David states that the law is truth. So if we want truth, if we want to abide by truth, something that is very important if you're going to have an honest relationship with God and not something that is of your own making, something that is really of your own doing, you really have to come back to the text and you have to base it on the text. And truth is definitely an element in any sort of quest for a relationship with God. You find also, and let me see what page this is on. I don't have the page number. In Psalms 119, 165, we find that the precepts and philosophies of Torah imbue you with physical and spiritual peace. They are something that make your life better, and they give you a rewarding relationship. So the question then comes, what is the most important element in developing a knowledge of Yahweh? And we find that the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge. It is the beginning of understanding. And it is really there where our knowledge begins. And it is really the element that that makes us accountable. Fearing Yahweh is the element that takes us off all the bunny trails and following our own way and brings us that back to being grounded on Yahweh's word. And let's look at a few of these. Psalms 19, verse 7. And I'm going to go here real quick. Psalms 19, verse 7 states that the fear of Yahweh is clean. It endures forever. So if it endures forever, it's not going to be just disappear. Exodus 34, verse 5, we find this idea that even though, actually, let's look at Exodus 34, verse 7. When Yahweh passes before Moses, he says that he will forgive and he keeps mercy for thousands, but he will not clear the guilty. And that often children of the third and fourth generation end up repeating and inheriting those sins, and often the consequences of those sins. It's just kind of the way things work. It's just kind of natural law that if you do not establish your children in the right way, or you don't give them the correct example to follow, children are very, very prone to just walking in the way of their forefathers, doing what they know and what they see, and repeating the same mistakes. I think each of us can look at world history and see where nations just keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And I believe that is what Exodus 34, verse 5 is addressing. But the key in that is that Yahweh will not hold the guiltless innocent, and that there are consequences. There is this natural law of reaping and sowing, of karma, as I often call it. And then Jeremiah 32, this was where we left last week. When Jeremiah talks about the latter-day restoration, when he talks about this movement where Yahweh gives them, and I'm just going to start right around verse 39. He says, I will give them one heart, one way, that they may know me forever, for the good of them. And again, this idea that you are going to know Yahweh, that implies some sort of tangible relationship and some sort of, you are actually knowing who Yahweh is. It's not just this nebulous idea of a creator God that just sits in some sort of limbo. So you find that he says, for the good of them and their children after them, and I will make an everlasting covenant with them, that I will not turn away for them to do them good. So this everlasting covenant is something where it benefits us. It is something that is for our good. And he promises to never again turn his face away from us. You know, for the last 2,500 years, we haven't seen much God in the world. We haven't seen a lot of the acts that we read about in the Bible, whether it's the parting of the sea, the miracles of the Exodus, or even the conquest, or later things that we see in Israel's history with Israel's prophets. We don't see that in the diaspora. It's just something that becomes sealed during the period of the hiding of the face. But when Yahweh returns, he promises to never again hide his face from us. And he says, I will put my fear in their hearts that they may not depart from me. So this is where we ended last week. The idea that it is this fear that even God himself will not turn his face from you, and that even when he returns to us, he will still hold us accountable. That brings sobriety, but it also brings freedom, because if he is going to hold us accountable, you know that he is not going to allow the strong to abuse and oppress the weak, the wealthy, the poor, or the indigent, or the strong, whether it be physical or in some other way. There will be a system of government that is fair. The land is divided among all citizens, and there are business practices that foster competition and foster liberty on the land. So I'm just going to read this. I'm at the top of page 293 if you guys want to follow along. The result of Yahweh's everlasting covenant is his fear in our hearts. The fear of Yahweh is the quality that sanctifies latter-day Israel. Walking in his fear alone will cause the people to never again depart from Yahweh or his way of life. So we have this foundation, and this kind of recaps the review. So now we're going to get into some concepts that I think most of us have been told are strictly concepts that don't arise until we get into the New Testament. And I'm going to challenge that idea, and I want to present that many of these concepts are very Tanakh concepts. So one of the first that we find is the idea that sin begins in the heart. Sin begins in the heart and the mind with what we allow ourselves to contemplate and what we allow ourselves to imagine. And let me just, I've gotten ahead of myself here, so let me catch up in my notes here real quick. Okay, so we find that in okay, hold on, I'm still ahead of myself. Okay, so we find this idea that sin begins in the heart, and let's look at a few of these verses. Proverbs 24 verse 9, and this is going to be Solomon again. He says, the thought of foolishness is sin, and the scorner is an abomination to men. So King Solomon, in his infinite wisdom, understood that the foolishness of the mind, the thought, was sin. Now, the word for thought in Proverbs 24:9 is makshaba, and that is, I hope I pronounced the Hebrew correct there, but makshaba. And it literally means thought. It is the thought process that each of us have. You find the word is used in Genesis 6:5 when Yahweh describes the imaginations of the heart that all the antediluvials had that were constantly wicked before him. And remember, before the flood, in the antediluvian period, that God had pronounced his whole entire creation good. He had pronounced it clean. He had pronounced it wonderful. And then he discovered a fatal flaw with humanity. And in Genesis 6:5, yeah, and I'm just going to read at the bottom of page 293 if you guys want to follow along. He says that he sees that the fatal flaw with the thoughts of the heart is what separate us from a relationship with God, because our sinful thoughts can become actions. Our desires determine our actions. And Isaiah readily acknowledges this when he says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So look at Isaiah 59, verse 13. Isaiah says, in transgressing and lying against Yahweh, and departing from the way, the direct of our God, speaking oppression and revolt, and conceiving, in other words, conceiving is thinking, and conceiving and uttering from the word words of falsehood. So there's this idea that you are going to speak things that go against the law. Remember, truth is defined in the law. So if you're going to utter things that go against the law, you have spoken falsehood. But all of those desires to contradict the law begin in the heart. They begin in the thoughts. We also have Jeremiah 7:24, where he again talks about the imagination of an evil heart. And Jeremiah states, but they listened not, nor inclined their ear, but they walked in the counsel of the imaginations of their evil hearts and went backward. Jeremiah, let's see, this is another one in Jeremiah 16:12. It says, you have done worse than your forefathers. For behold, you have walked every one after the imagination of his evil heart. So Torah readily acknowledges that sin begins in the heart. Yahweh saw that the thoughts and desires, the imagination of the heart, were crucial to human salvation. This is why he exhorted Israel to place the law in her heart so she could be set her heart on spiritual truths that would endow her with his eternal bread of life. So the idea there is that God acknowledges that the human heart has this tendency, this propensity to evil. Some people call it an evil nature, an evil inclination. It did not preclude humanity from being righteous or attaining a state of righteousness, but God just acknowledges that, hey, you know, you have this history of wanting and desiring to do evil. So God gave Israel a method whereby she could fight against her evil heart. She could subvert it and establish righteousness instead. So if you look at Deuteronomy 6:6, one of the ways that God gave Israel a heart was Deuteronomy 6:6. And these words which I command you this day shall be in your heart. Okay, and Cindy, Tanakh-based studies, you've made some great points. I'm going to come back to these in just a little bit. So keep making your statements. We'll come back and discuss them at the end after we've covered the material. And but please keep making your comments. Great comments. And thank you, Cindy, for your post as well. So we also find that in Psalms 119, verse 11, King David says that he has hid Yahweh's word, his Torah, in his heart, that he may not sin against God. You find this other idea in Psalms 40, verse 8, this idea that we delight to do God's will, and that it is Yahweh's law within our hearts that enables our delight. Again, Psalms 119, verse 34, David says, give me understanding and I will keep your law. Yes, I will observe it with my whole heart. My hands also I will lift up to your commandments, which I have loved, and I will meditate on your statutes. Let my heart be sound in your statutes, and I will not be ashamed. So again, we find this idea that loving Yahweh, loving his constitutional way of life, is what gives us and imbues this spiritual relationship with God. You know, God talks about how he will not hear the sinner, how those that have an evil heart or an evil mind, their prayer is an abomination to him. Or if you bring a sacrifice and you don't have the right attitude, the right spirit, God's not going to listen to you. He doesn't want platitudes. He's not looking for just a vain fulfillment of the law. He wants your whole heart, and he wants you to have and to develop the right character. You know, growing up, this was referred to as holy, righteous character, something that is not just for outward show, something that becomes innate. It becomes a part of you. On page 295, I'm going to go ahead and read this. It says, Yahweh's law taught that sin began with Israel's heart's desires. She could easily avoid sin and sorrow if she loved the spiritual precepts or ethics embedded in his law, if she meditated on them and lived by them. By loving Yahweh's law and choosing to walk in his ways, Israel grew strong through Yahweh, so she could easily obey the law. So notice this is kind of self-perpetuating. The more Israel focuses on the law, the more she learns to love it, the more it enables Israel to observe and keep the law, and for her society to become sanctified and a peculiar people. So it really becomes self-perpetuating. I think anything that you do like is positive. There's the old adage, you know, you become what you think about, or you become what you talk about or what you observe. So whatever you focus your attention on, the qualities that you give to it, you often absorb yourself. Now, God also recognized that while sin began in the heart, there was a desire, one particular desire above all others, that caused Israel's heart to go astray. And this was the desire of covetousness. Desiring something that isn't yours, whether it is another person's house, car, something else that belongs to someone else, or even desiring someone else to support you could be a form of covetousness, because their income is something that they earn for themselves and their family. It is their reaping and their sowing. And when you covet and when you want part of their reaping, when you have not sown what they have and you want that for yourself, that is a form of coveting. So God gives Israel some very strong words. He says that in Numbers 15:39, he says, remember all the commandments. This is Moses speaking to Israel. Remember all the commandments that Yahweh, and do them, that you seek not after your own heart and your own eyes, which you have thus far used to go a-whoring. You know, this is really a totally different message that we find in Torah versus one that is popular today. Today, in most churches, even outside of churches, just in agnostic, mainstream, carefree America, we have this saying that is, just do what's in your heart. I mean, you hear that time and time again. It's told to generation, especially millennials, over and over again, just do what's in your heart. But God's instructions totally contradict that. He says, be careful what is in your heart. Do not go after your own heart. Refrain from your heart's desires and order your heart in the way of my law. Make sure that your heart's desires match up with my law, that your thoughts, your attitudes, and most of all, discipline yourself so that you can be in line with that law. And remember that in Proverbs 4:2, Solomon tells us that good doctrine comes from the law. And again, Proverbs is a king's instruction for his son. So this would have been kind of Solomon's legacy for Rehoboam, a way of life and a philosophy on life that Solomon leaves as legacy for his son. But it contains enormous truth and enormous principles that we can learn from today. We also find that in Torah, physical commands are often hinged on the spiritual, and vice versa. And I'm going to share this with you because I think this really says it better than anything that I could say here tonight. Yahweh bestowed his spiritual truth and doctrine in his physical law. His spiritual truth encompassed the physical law. So strongly did he ground Israel in physical law, which embodied his spiritual truth, that she could never be led astray if she obeyed. If another God or another religion taught her to dismiss any part of the Creator's law, she could instantly know that God was false, since it contradicted the truth of the law. Remember that the one precept of truth is constancy and freedom from change. Remember in chapter 1, when we established the parameters for this trial of God, and we looked at the concepts of truth, concepts that are truth that exist, whether we look at scripture, whether we look at science, whether it's medical science, cosmology, archaeology. There are truths that exist, whether we acknowledge them or not. So the idea that there is this freedom from change is something we can hang our hat on as far as the Tanakh is concerned. So keep that in mind as in this next part. It says, if any God or prophet spoke in Yahweh's name, claiming that Israel no longer had to remember all the commandments of Yahweh to do them, that's Numbers 15:39, then Israel could immediately be assured that the deity or prophet who spoke in Yahweh's name had no authority from Yahweh. Now, this is important because even though sin began in the heart of humanity, God did not place any judgment on humanity. Let me reiterate that. The Tanakh readily acknowledges that sin begins in the heart. God does not punish you for the sin that is in your heart. He does not punish you until the sin in your heart manifests itself into a physical action. So what does God do with that sin that is in your heart? And this is something that is a very important concept. I debated whether or not to cover it tonight, but I think it's important that we do, because we're going to come back to this concept when we get to chapter 17. And it's very important that we are really firmly grounded with what God does when he sees sin in our heart. Like, Job talks about being like Adam and hiding sin in his bosom. So what does God do when he sees that, okay, we're not sinning physically, we haven't done anything that violates the law, we're totally in line with the law as far as the way we're living our life, but yet he sees in our words and in our actions this these ideas and these things that we say that violate the precepts of his law. What does he do? You find that God places his people, whether it be an individual or a society, he places them in slippery places to see whether or not those actions will manifest into something that violates the law, or whether they will continue in a righteous path. So I'm going to read to you a Psalm of Asaph. This is Psalm 73. Remember, Asaph was a temple singer. He was a prophet, and he was head of all the prophets in the temple. He talks about in the beginning of Psalms 12 how it seemed as though there were no judgments for the ungodly. They really could do whatever they want. They envied, they were foolish, and they were corrupt in every way. They spoke loftily concerning oppression. Notice it doesn't say that they did oppression, but that perhaps their political views were oppressive, or the policies they were embracing were oppressive. And Asaph thought that these people, there was no judgment of them, that in verse 12, he says, they prosper in the world, they increase in riches. And he says, here I am daily cleansing my heart, making sure I'm right with God. But there just doesn't seem to be any justice in this. But here's the key of what the nugget that Asaph has left for us. He says, when I thought to know this, it was too painful for me, until I went into the sanctuary of God. Then understood I their end. Surely you did set them in slippery places. You cast them down to destruction. How they are brought into destruction in a moment. They are utterly consumed with errors. So the idea that we have is that when God sees that there is falsehood in your doctrine, if your precepts depart from the way of Yahweh, he's going to place you in a slippery place to see if it manifests into a physical action, or to see if you continue on a right way. Sometimes you'll recognize the error and you'll repent, you'll teshuva, you'll come back. Other times you'll continue on your path until you hit that brick wall. So what we find is that the type of tests that God gives to us when he puts us in slippery places are multifold. Sometimes they can be false prophets. You know, even today we have all of these healers. I call them a lot of them are your seed preachers who will go around and they will, you know, claim, give me your money and you will be blessed. This will happen. You know, all of those are tests, and a lot of people fail those tests by giving those idiots their money. You have a lot of people who claim healing, and that's not the way Yahweh heals. You know, he really heals by more of a preventative medicine method. But you find that all of these guys speak something that is comfortable to the heart, something that is peaceable, rather than speaking the truth, which is not always easy to hear. So you find that God places Israel in slippery places. He refines the heart of man. And in Deuteronomy 8:2, if you'll turn there, or this is on page 297, Yahweh tells Israel, he warns Israel way ahead of time. He says, I'm going to test you to see if you're going to obey my law. But God only tests humanity when he sees that there is sin in their heart. He says, and you will remember the way that Yahweh your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and to prove you. So the whole entire point of the wilderness experience, of having very little food, of having to rely on manna from heaven, of the entire experience of walking and wandering around and having to listen to the way that Yahweh tells them they should go in their travel and their journeys, it's not only to humble them, but it's to test them, to see if they're going to follow the way of Yahweh or if they're going to bicker, complain, and rebel against it. And I think we all know what ancient Israel's outcome was at that experience. Again, in 1 Chronicles 28, verse 9, Yahweh says to Solomon, he says, my son, know you God of your father, and serve him with a perfect heart and with a willing mind. For Yahweh searches all hearts and understands the imaginations of the thoughts. You know, a God that searches hearts and knows our imaginations, this implies a very personal concept of God. Because if it's just this deity that is like the deist idea or the agnostic idea of a hands-off God, that's not what this text supports. He searches the hearts and understands the imaginations of man. If you seek him, he will be found of you. But if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. That is a personal idea of God, a God that is not inaccessible. Again, we find this idea within the idea of searching the hearts and the minds, that God is trying man, proving us when he sees sin in the heart, whether or not we will follow him or whether we will depart. Jeremiah 17 verse 9 reiterates this. He says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? I, Yahweh, search the heart. I try the reins, even to give to every man according to his ways and according to the fruit of his doings. So there is a natural law involved here. But even with this natural law, God is always trying their hearts. If he sees that there's sin in your heart, he's going to put some sort of test, some sort of temptation to see if you're going to follow the precepts in your law or whether you will depart from them. I'm going to just read this. This is on page 298. It says, although sin originated in the heart, Yahweh did not punish human beings for the sins in their hearts and minds. Rather, he set those whose hearts had turned away from him in slippery places to see if their sins in their heart would manifest into a physical action. So this is, again, part of that process where Isaiah says, behold, I have refined you in the furnace of affliction. I will try a man, and I will refine humanity into the gold of a fur. This refining process involves a lot of Holocaust, a lot of persecutions. But notice each of these Holocaust, all of these persecutions, inquisitions, everything that is really thrown at us, it's because we failed the test. It's not because we passed the test and we were righteous. It was because our communities, our society failed the test on very fundamental levels, on key basic precepts. We have oppressed our brother. We have declined from the law, and it has not afforded us the God-given protection that naturally exists within Torah. Now, another point that I want to bring out regarding the trying of the heart of man and not punishing for the sins of the heart. Remember, the Torah is a constitution, and it was given to a national government. Had God placed consequences for the thoughts of the mind and the heart, Israel would have functioned as a police state. It would have been very totalitarian, very oppressive. Things that we see in Islamic countries today, things that we saw under Stalin. That is how ancient Israel society would have functioned had God put judgments for the heart within Israel's moral code. Thankfully, Yahweh didn't do that. Yahweh really leads the heart and the mind as something that is his judgment alone. That is something that humanity cannot judge. And David makes that point clear in many places in the Psalms. He says, "Who knows the heart but you, O Yahweh?" So those, I think, are concepts that we need to have before we go on and we examine other concepts. The other thing that God really finds in humanity, so a lot of times he'll find pride, he'll find arrogancy. When he sees that, he'll put you in a slippery place to try you, to test you, to see if you will pass the test or if you will fail. And we are exhorted to remember in Deuteronomy 8:5 that as God chastens a son, so Yahweh tests and he corrects us, he chastens us. As a parent who desires the best for his children, Yahweh desired to teach his children to walk in the only way of life that would bring happiness, peace, prosperity, and a close relationship with him. When people erred from his way, he would try, instruct, and teach and discipline them so they could learn to correctly walk in his way and discern when their hearts and souls were spiritually lacking in his sight. As Job's friend Elihu adeptly phrased it, yes, he renders to a man according to each of them as he does. In a man's path, he will find him. And that's Job 34:11. So we've kind of given an overview of the spiritual aspects. Now I want to get down to something a little bit more specific. Something that in the ancient Israel's argument, as well as in the modern Ptolemaic, there is this charge that if you've broken one law, you've broken them all. So if you can't keep all the Torah, you can't keep any of it. And since you can't keep all the Torah, then all are unrighteous. None can be clean in Yahweh's sight. None can be holy or, have a restored relationship with God. So it's really a generality, an argument of generalities, and it's kind of a catch-all approach to the Tanakh. But I'm going to challenge this on this idea, and we're going to look at the idea of sin in the Tanakh. There are basically three categories of sin. The first is chata, which it just basically means missing the mark. And if you guys are following along, I am on page 300, and I need to find, okay, I found my pen. With chata, it is the idea that you have violated or somebody has violated a very specific written command within Torah. This would be if somebody had committed adultery, theft, they had violated cleanliness issues, they had eaten something unclean, violating kashrut, they had cursed God audibly, they had planned a murder and carried it out. All of those are sins. It is something that is specifically written in Torah. And, a lot of people still hold to this idea that that is all that sin is violating what is specifically written in Torah. I'm going to challenge you that there's more there than meets the eye. And that leads me to the second category of sin, which is Yvonne. Now, in the KJV and the JPS Tanakh, as well as in most of your translations, they do not use fidelity when translating these three categories of sin. They really just give it the generic sin and iniquity. Now, I will say that the KJV is pretty good with translating Yvonne as iniquity, which is exactly what Yvonne means. It means iniquity or perversity. So it's a little bit stronger than just a sin and just violating something that is written. It is a perversion of the fundamental constitutional precept within the law. And it is not always written. So let me give you some examples. We know in Torah that homosexuality is something that is banned. It is something that is written and something that is specific. By the same token, the homosexual act, even though it is not written as being forbidden to females, by the same concept, it is forbidden to females. So because it is based on the perversion of the act, not on the gender of the individual. So even though female homosexuality is not specifically addressed, it is an extension of the original command based on the perversion or the iniquity in the act. The same with male prostitution. Even though female prostitution is banned in Torah, male prostitution is not banned in Torah. So does that mean that it is therefore okay because it's not mentioned? No. The perversity is in the act. The iniquity is in the act, and it again is not in the gender. The same thing for child molestation. When Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 21 establish a morality code, it goes to great lengths to the relationships and type of relationships that are acceptable. Torah does not specifically ban child molestation or child sexual contact. Does that therefore mean that it is okay because it is not mentioned? No, it does not mean that it's okay. It is a perversity of the command of what are healthy human relationships. This could also be extrapolated when Yahweh says, therefore choose life. Yahweh has given us a pattern of healthy foods. He's taught us, these are the foods that are healthy. But by extension, if you find that something else is unhealthy, something else that has been created by society, and you discover that it's unhealthy, whether it's smoking, GMOs, which are man-made, that's not something that God gave us. If you discover that something is unhealthy, then choose life. That's really what it comes down to. So the sin in this, and you have to be careful, because the sin in this is the iniquity and the perversion of the statute, the perversion of the concept and the constitutional philosophy. And you have to be careful here, because some people say that, well, anytime you go by something that is not specifically written, you're really creating your own oral Torah. And I totally disagree with this, because you are extrapolating what is specifically written. You are not adding your own. So let me give you an example of something that would be adding your own Torah or your own instruction to the law. In Torah, we are told to keep the Shabbat holy. We're given a few things. Don't work on the Shabbat. Allow your servants and your people who work in your house, give them a day of rest. There's some indication that perhaps we shouldn't cook on Shabbat. We should prepare ahead of time. But beyond that, there is no other stipulation on how to observe the Shabbat. If you add to that, and you start adding your own rules and regulations as to how the Shabbat should be observed, that is adding your own oral law. That is adding your own instruction. But there is no perversity in saying that, we're going to observe Shabbat, or maybe, one family elects to do it in a particular method. The perversity or the iniquity is in adding to the law something that the Torah prohibits, or deleting from it. Taking a command and extrapolating based on what is specifically written is exactly what the Torah instructs us to do. And in fact, that's what the Levites did in their day. Now, the last category, because remember I mentioned there were three categories of sin. The last category is pesha, or ma'al. And this is the strongest category of sin. It is an open and wanton rebellion against Torah. So in this state of sin, the people are going to defy the judges. Remember, Moses installed judges and leaders of the land. In this type of sin, Israel is going to disregard the counsel of their judges. They're going to support policies. They're going to support social ideas that contradict the Torah. So Israel's not going to sanctify the Shabbat. They're going to work on the Shabbat. Israel is going to ignore kashrut. As a society or even an individual, they're going to support homosexuality. Or even you're going to find that when the premeditated murder occurs, people are not going to be diligent about seeking justice for the victim or their family. They're really just going to turn a blind eye and just let the system handle it. And so this is the strongest state of rebellion. It goes beyond what is just written. It goes beyond, it includes the ideas of both missing the mark in the original, the chata, as well as the iniquity and the perversity in the action. It's really to the point where they don't care. They could be complacency, but it's complacency mixed with rebellion within that society. Now, one other point to be careful when you use Avon and you are looking for perversity and the iniquity, the extension of the law. While we could extend it to perhaps food and eating, healthy smoking as something that would be banned under the law because it leads to death and we're told to choose life. Again, be careful, because lying is something that, lying to your neighbor is not something that the Torah forbids. Lying to defraud is forbidden, but lying to preserve life is not forbidden. So you have to be very careful, and you have to be diligent to make sure that your concepts, your philosophies are totally grounded on the Torah. And I'm just going to read this on page 300. Although Yahweh wrote his law based on precepts, we need to be careful what we construe to be iniquity or perversity and sin, which is the breach of his law. Although lesbianism or child molestation can definitely be considered perversities under the law, the act of lying cannot. Yahweh only forbids lying or deception when it is used with the intent to defraud or to harm another. Yahweh did not forbid lying or deception when it was used for life-saving measures, such as the midwife's deception of Pharaoh in Exodus 1:18, Rahab's lie to Jericho's guard that saved Israel's spies in Joshua 2 and 6:17, Jael's deception of Sisera, Ehud's lie that led to Israel's triumph over her enemies. Remember, Ehud lied and deceived so that he could murder Israel's adversary. This really wasn't considered something that was a crime according to the law, because it was used to protect Israel and to grant their freedom. It was a time of war. When Yahweh desired to judge Ahab's wickedness, he caused the prophet Micaiah to lie to Ahab so that the oppressive king would be lulled into a false sense of security. This is 1 Kings 22:13. Ahab's false hope and false belief would then easily deliver him into Yahweh's hand. Yahweh's law did not forbid lying or deception when done for righteous causes, but it did forbid lying with the intent to defraud one's neighbor. So just keep that in mind, because again, when you look at the perversities in the law, you have to totally ground your precepts and your philosophies on exactly what is written. So this brings us back around to, if there is iniquity, if you have sinned in one of these three categories, how do you get right with God? And we find that there is means by which God has given to us. But notice in the idea of these consequent three different categories of sins, that there is not this generality of one size fits all. there are graduated consequences for each type of rebellion. The last type of rebellion is really something that becomes on a national level and is something that God deals with as an overthrow of society. He brings foreign nations to render his judgment. You find that there's graduated consequences. You don't have the same consequence for murder that you do for theft or for deceit. You know, if you've defrauded someone, you repay. Or for, accidental crimes. They're not one and the same. They are very graduated and they address different issues. So this idea that you break them one, you break them all, is totally alien to anything that is in the Tanakh, or totally anything that is in ancient Israel's constitution or the modern US Constitution. You find also that God gave Israel the means by which to be in total liberty. And I'm just going to read this because I can't really relate it better than what it was originally. So bear with me. We're just going to read through this. We have seen that God wanted the best for Israel. He saw that guilt hindered the freedom he had ordained for her citizens. Yahweh saw that feelings of culpability, inadequacy, and low self-esteem could destroy the confidence and strength that Israel could have by walking in his way of life. When he commanded Israel to love her neighbor and to rebuke him when he sinned, Yahweh intended to relieve his children from bearing the burden of guilt. If a person rebuked his brother's sin, then the brother could turn from his sin before the consequences or the guilt became too great. But even more than this, a brother's rebuke kept Israel's society firmly grounded in the law, so people did not bear unnecessary guilt for actions that did not violate the law. If, for instance, a husband committed adultery, the wife did not need to feel unnecessary guilt for not meeting her husband's demands or provoking him to sin, which, I have several friends who are divorced. They have gone through horrible times where the husband had affairs. Sometimes it was multiple affairs. And that was one of the things that they expressed, was this inadequacy, as though somehow the husband's sin was their fault. Or children of divorced parents expressing this idea that somehow their parents' divorce was their fault. Yahweh is very clear to assign guilt to the guilty parties, and that keeps Israel happy. It's not this overwhelming guilt where it is destructive, but rather it is more of a culpability that allows for healing. There's the old adage, you have to first admit your problem before you can move on or before you can be healed. And this is really what God does. He establishes, hey, let's identify the issue. Let's not, dance around it. Let's take ownership of it, own your guilt. And now let's proceed to the second part, which is making restitution, which is seeking healing and seeking progress from the state that we were previously in. So God did tie the relieving of sin, the restitution, the restoration to sacrifices. But we also find that true sacrifice, that what God really wants, in ancient times, they really didn't have the currencies that we have today. A man could go through his whole entire life and never touch money, gold and silver, as we have today, or some sort of currency. Back in ancient times, the only viable means of wealth that they had were livestock, something that everybody really had, and it was the sustenance of ancient Israel's economy and their society. So Yahweh tied sacrifices to this economic system. But you find that they were a penalty of wealth. When you sinned, when you harmed someone else, it had to cost you something so that it would deter you from doing it again and harming your brother a second time. You find that even though there were physical and monetary means for restoration and penalties to discourage those actions from being repeated, what Yahweh really wanted, what he really sought, was the restoration of your heart. He wanted you to teshuvah so that you could return to him and return to his life-giving law. In Psalms 51:17, David tells us, the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O Yahweh, you will not despise. So the true sacrifice is an attitude that is willing to obey even when it's not convenient. It is turning, you can be a mile deep into a way of life, into something that violates Yahweh's way. The moment you turn, the moment you stop and you teshuvah to Yahweh, there is forgiveness, there is restoration, and you can still find favor in his sight. Psalms 5:11, David says, but let all those that put their trust in you rejoice. Let them ever shout for joy, because you defended them. Let them also love your name and be joyful in you. For you, O Yahweh, will bless the righteous with favor. You will compass him with a shield. So when you turn to righteousness, God blesses you with favor in his sight. So now this brings us to the next charge. And again, we are going over tonight because I really don't want to leave this study hanging to next week. I think this is important that we cover it all in one session. And even though we return to Yahweh when we sin, even though we are granted favor in his sight, and we can be restored to a relationship with him. You know, he tries our hearts and our minds. He restores us. Can we, or rather did ancient Israel, because this is the other part of the charge, was that even though the law was good for ancient Israel, they really never had Yahweh's spirit to enable them to obey the law. So the question that I had in the course of my studies was, did ancient Israel have Yahweh's spirit? And this is what the Tanakh testifies on the matter. Nehemiah 9:20, Nehemiah states, you gave also your good spirit to instruct them, and you withheld not your manna from their mouth, and gave them water for their thirst. Yet many years you did forbear them, and you testified against them by your spirit in your prophets. Yet they would not give ear. Therefore you gave them into the hand of the people of the lands. Nehemiah understood, and remember, Nehemiah was someone who was seen to have Yahweh's spirit. The second temple remnant did not begin, the Levites did not begin partaking the holy things until a Levite of the house of Aaron came with the Urim and the Thummim to that second temple period. So Ezra speaks with a lot of weight in this, and he understood that during the wilderness epoch that ancient Israel had Yahweh's spirit. In Psalms 143, David says, teach me to do your will, for you are my God, and your spirit is good. Lead me into the land of uprightness. So here David says that his spirit will lead him to the land of uprightness. There's another verse, I don't have it here tonight, but in Chronicles, David states that he created the blueprints of the first temple by the hand of Yahweh's spirit. So Yahweh's spirit was leading, guiding, and directing David. You find in Psalms 51:12, after David sins, he says, restore to me the joy of your salvation and uphold me with your free spirit. So there's this idea that Israel freely had Yahweh's spirit. And again, in 2 Samuel 23:2, David says that his Yahweh's spirit spoke by him. You find in Zechariah 4:6, the prophet states that that the second temple would not be built because of the second temple's righteousness. It wouldn't be built by their military strength, by their support of Persia or anything of the sort. The second temple would be rebuilt by the power and through Yahweh's spirit, by him making people adversaries and people all around willing. That is how Yahweh would foster the rebuilding of the second temple. So this idea that ancient Israel was deficient, that they didn't have Yahweh's Spirit, is really not something that you find is supported by the text. Zechariah says that his Spirit would enable the temple, and David says that Yahweh had a free spirit, something that was freely accessible. Deuteronomy really brings this home in Deuteronomy 4:7, when Moses says, "For what nation is there so great, who has Yahweh so nigh to them, as Yahweh our God in all things that we call upon him for?" So this idea that God is close to you implies relationship. It implies a spirit, an attitude of generosity, of positive relations, of the word is slipping me right now, of gratuity between the two of you. Goodwill, that's the word I'm looking for. Goodwill between the two of you. Psalms 34 verse 18, David says, "Yahweh is nigh to them that are of a broken heart, and saves such as be of a contrite spirit." If God is close to you, if you have to, it says, "to them that are of a broken heart." This doesn't mean it's just for the king, it's just for the leaders of the people. This is to all those that have a broken heart. God is close to them. And then, of course, we have 2 Chronicles 7:14. "If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, I will hear." So this is God hearing the petition of man. "I will hear from heaven, forgive their sins, and I will heal their land." Yahweh was willing to have a close relationship with any who were willing to humble themselves to observe his law. Yahweh could willingly forgive humanity's sins and restore his righteous nature within them if only they humbled their own spirits to be submissive to his. Yahweh was ever ready to develop and cultivate his spiritual character in his people so they would become a righteous example to all nations and a blessing to all people. So you have this idea in Torah that it's totally restitutionary. It restores the heart, it restores the soul, it prolongs the days of your life. But don't take my word for it. Don't take my idea that ancient Israel was capable of observing the law completely, fully, and to total capacity. Rather, take the word of the Torah. The question is, did God lie to us? Did he give us falsehood, or did he give us truth? This is what Torah says, and this is Deuteronomy 30, verse 11. "For this commandment which I command you this day is not hidden from you, neither is it afar off in the heaven, that you should say, who shall go over to heaven and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it? Neither is it beyond the sea, that you should say, who shall go over the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it? But the word is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it." This right here, Torah tells us, Yahweh tells us that ancient Israel could have done, they had the complete capacity, the complete ability to obey every aspect of the Torah. Deuteronomy 32, verse 46, Moses says to them, "Set your hearts to do all the words which I testify among you this day, which you shall command your children to do, all the words of this law. For it is not a vain thing for you, because it is your life. And through this thing you will prolong your days in the land where you go to possess it." So Yahweh's law is easy for humanity to obey. David reiterates this in Psalms 81:13 when he says, "Oh, that my people had listened to me, and Israel had walked in my ways. I soon should have subdued their enemies and turned my hand against their adversaries. The haters of Yahweh should have submitted themselves to him, but their time should have endured forever. He should have fed them as with the finest of wheat, and with honey of a rock I should have satisfied you." So there's this idea that Israel's time, Israel's prosperity, Israel's time of salvation would endure forever if they would but obey the law, if they would have listened to Yahweh. And again, the prophets in Isaiah 48, "Thus saith Yahweh, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel, I am Yahweh your God, which teaches you to profit." He teaches us to prosper. which led you by the way you should go. Oh, that you had listened to my commandment. Then had your peace been as a river, and your righteousness as the waves of the sea. So we find that Yahweh wants us to prosper. He wants to prolong our days, and that his law enables this. His law is perfect. His law is able to heal the soul, and his law does not get washed in the realm of generalities. And I'm going to close with this. These examples demonstrate that the ancient Israel indeed had the tools necessary to obey Yahweh's law. The Creator provided Israel with his willing spirit. He endowed her with a spiritual law that spoke to the needs of her heart and willingly forgave her when she turned from her sins. His law provided Israel with healthy precepts that could cure all her diseases, and provided a moral code to strengthen the relations of her society to effect perfect peace without death. So that pretty much says it all. You know, Yahweh gave Israel a way of life that worked. He gave them a state of eternalness wherein there was no death. And it is something that I think we can go back to and we can learn to from today. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for general discussions. I think I'm going to work backwards. I'm going to catch the latest comments first and just work backwards in the discussion. So Betty says, exactly who are his people and what does it mean to be called by his name? How is someone called by his name? I think Isaiah gives us some good indication of this. It's really this people that spring up out of nowhere today, in today's context. He tells us that one will call himself by the name of Jacob, and one will surname himself. Let's see, I'm trying to find this. It's right around Isaiah 58. Let me see if I can find this real quick. Let me see. I'm going to look this up real quick. And if you guys have any questions or comments, please post them. Yeah, in Isaiah 44, where one shall say, I am Yahweh's, the other shall call himself by the name of Jacob, and another shall subscribe with his hand unto Yahweh, and surname himself by the name of Israel. Now, I think all of us that are identifying ourselves as Yahweh's people, we are fulfilling this. We are doing it. We are calling ourselves out, and we are responding to Yahweh's ancient call that he left for us to hear down through this day. So how are we called? How is someone called by his name? I think by identifying as Israel. You know, the name Israel incorporated part of the theocratic name, or the theophoric name, where it's YL, and that, or I'm sorry, YI is how it transliterates, and that is part of Yahweh's name. That when we say that we're of Israel and we identify with that, we are taking that on ourselves. Okay, Tanakh Study says, I'm glad you keep driving home that it must be grounded in Torah. Good teaching, says. Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Cindy says, I'm glad you are addressing the female homosexuality. It was something I was asked a few years back and couldn't find it in Torah. I was wondering why. Right. Yeah, you find a lot of things. You know, this idea, I think we can really get trapped in this idea that Torah has to address every single situation that could arise. What Yahweh tells Moses is that he's given Moses the precept, he's given Moses the foundation, so that he can extrapolate and apply those to new situations as they arise. All right, and Robin and Jack, y'all post Psalms 139. I'm going to look this up. 139 verse, let me shorten this a little bit so I can see. Psalms 139 verse 23. And yes, great text. David says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. See if there be any wicked way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. That is a great verse that really shows humanity's ability to have a relationship with God. And Robin and Jack point out that a lot of the teachings of the generalities of some of the accusations against Yahweh and his law come down to relativism. That's a great point. Tanakh-based study says 1 Samuel 17:6b, the Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by the outward appearances, but Yahweh looks on their heart, or the Lord looks on the heart. Great point. So, so true. You bring up again 1 Samuel. Okay, you posted it twice. Perfect. And then Cindy, you brought up Zamah. I'm not exactly sure. Okay. Yes, that is a different Hebrew word for thought. I believe the word that I brought up was, let me look through my notes here. It was, Ma'ak Shaba. So very related terms. You find there's a lot of synonyms that really convey similar meanings in Torah. So, oh yes, the testing of the heart. Okay, hold on before we get there. Betty says, just wanted to let you know that answers to my questions were something I prayed to yesterday. Good timing. Oh, wonderful, Betty. Wonderful. And actually, you know, Betty, I did receive your email. I just have not had time to respond to it because I am going to write something back. So don't think that I have forgotten about you. I did see it in my inbox. Yeah, the testing of the heart is something that is something that we really need to understand at this point before we go forward, because we're going to come back to it when we look at prophecy and when we look at some very tough issues, when we look as to the suffering in the world. Why has it seemed that God has abandoned his people for the past 2,500 years? We need to really be grounded in this idea that when sin is in our hearts, God does send testing and trials to see which way we will go. Stephen says, are you going to address ways to atone for different kinds of sin? I really did not get into that so much here. I felt, yeah, I just really didn't get into that. That is an article that I may present at another point in time. Nehemiah Gordon does have a pretty good article on this. So because people had access to his work on that, I really didn't feel that it was necessary for me to cover it as well. But there are graduated sins. You know, flour was one of the atonements you could bring if you were very poor and you couldn't afford anything else. Flour was kind of like your penalty of last resort, or your payment of last resort. And I know we tend to want to spiritualize a lot of the different types of payment for our penalties, but a lot of those were just economic in that not everyone had gold or silver at their disposal. A lot of times it was just your produce of your land, like Abel brought, or it was, I'm sorry, like Abel brought, or it was the flocks and herds. I have that backwards. Like the flocks and herds, like Abel brought, or the produce from your fields, like Cain bought. In a poor society, that is often a lot of what you have. So, all right. So Tanakh-based studies said, agree. Great teaching this evening. Thank you, from Danielle. Oh, hey, Danielle. Great to see you. So any other questions? I'm going to keep the room open a few minutes later. We did go very, very late tonight, simply because there was so much to cover. I really didn't want to miss anything. And I am going to be teaching at Roots of Faith on March 7th. And I think I'm going to break this up into a two-part teaching. Just to reiterate it, I'm going to come at it from a little bit different perspective, but just want to really drill some of these concepts home, because I want you guys to have this information at your fingertips, because you know you're challenged by others, you know, and they claim, they make all these accusations about God and his law and how it's inadequate. And I want you to be totally prepared and totally ready. Yes, perfect, Cindy. No class next week. We will meet, let me write this. We will meet on the, let me look it up here. We will meet again on the 26th. And the next week we get into some of the fun historical aspects, which is going to be who wrote the Bible. I'm thinking we can do chapter 8 in 2, maybe 3 sessions. I am going to look through the material. I'm going to post an updated reading schedule, both to the Yahweh Exists page as well as to my Facebook page. And that way you guys can, you know, just keep up with the material if you want to. Robin and Jack say, do you think that's also an identity issue for many of us? Are being outside mainstream camps being a testing of our willingness to follow only his instructions without distortions or additions? No, I do, Robin. You know, I think that sometimes people want community, they want friendships, they want, you know, it's really hard being alone. And so many times I think that we kind of will sacrifice a contextual approach, and will revert to accepting what the majority accepts, with additions and deletions from Torah, and following after the teachings of man, just so that we can have friends and we can relate to other people. But in the end, we miss out on that blessing and that understanding that comes from Yahweh's way of life. And in the end, I think that, you know, there are a whole lot more friends that you will be blessed with as time goes on. You know, I don't know about you guys, but I am just seeing this Tanakh-based movement take off left, right, and center, with more people returning to Yahweh all the time. It's like every week I'm coming across somebody new who has new questions, or who is seeking, or, you know, they're in some way. So I think, you know, us staying true to the text and us being a strong support system is something that I think will help others as we go along. Cindy says, I have seen him knit the hearts, minds, and souls of his kids together, especially through social media. Totally agree. It's the Facebook movement of the restoration. So totally agree. Also, just going to put this out. I don't believe Ross is resurrecting the dialogue list. I am going to, I believe, create a Yahoo list that everyone can participate in. You can post questions, comments, and especially prayer requests along that line as well. So hopefully in the next week, I will have that information. I will post it everywhere. So if everybody wants to be part of that Facebook group, it will predominantly cater, I think, to the Roots of Faith crowd, as well as those that are part of the Yahweh Exists. I'm sure there'll be some crossover, and anyone, it's going to be an open forum, so anybody's welcome to join. So once I post it and have it up there, feel free to share it far and wide. It's not exclusive in any way. Messianics are welcome. Anyone is welcome, and it'll just hopefully be a way to further knit our hearts together and uplift each other and encourage each other, and ask questions that we come across in our day-to-day studies, or even maybe something in your personal life, something where we can have that interaction. So without further ado, I'm going to say Shabbat Shalom. I look forward to seeing you all at 10:30 tomorrow morning at Roots of Faith for part 5 of Ross's Messiah series, something I have really enjoyed. So Shabbat Shalom, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.